Good morning, everyone, and thanks for inviting us here. My name is Wim Zwijnenburg. I work for PAX on the humanitarian disarmament team, and I'm also working for Bellingcat, an open source research collective. And part of my work is looking at the environmental impacts of armed conflicts. And during this work, in particular for Bellingcat, I use a lot of open source data, and we try to use the data and also to tell people what the story is. And the work for PAX, I do a lot of work in conflict-affected areas, and increasingly we notice much more impact from the climate change on the countries where we worked in. So earlier this year I was at a conference, and I met Cornelia, uh, and did a really interesting talk about the work she's doing on open source and climate. So we joined forces, and today we're going to talk a bit about the work we're building at the moment for Bellingcat on making climate data, and in particular climate security data, much more accessible. But first, give you Cornelia a time to introduce.
Thank you, Wim. And hello, everyone. Thanks so much for having us today. My name is Cornelia Scholz. I'm originally from Austria. I work for the Red Cross Climate Center as a geoinformation specialist. So for the Climate Center, we're a research and information institution to really support the wider Red Cross movement in questions around climate topics and generally climate change questions. And for myself, my background originally was in natural disasters and more specifically in mountain risk engineering in the Austrian Alps. But then I got really interested in the more wider humanitarian context around the world, and I specialized on using geoinformation systems and open access data to really understand and investigate compounding impacts of climate and conflict on vulnerable groups all around the world. So my work is really either taking me remotely or in person to a lot of different countries, a lot of different settings, trying to understand the really complex interaction we see there.
So what we're going to talk about today is a sort of preview for the work for the guide we're making for Bellingcat. But before we go into that, quickly some thoughts around climate and security. So we've seen how climate impact is really affecting fragile states, but also conflict-affected countries. And more we're getting questions also from journalists. Hey, we're doing a story. We want to look into this, but how is exactly? What is the? Can you help us with data? How to visualize things? How can we make connections between what we find on the ground and on the remote data? But at the same time, we also see there's a really, we saw in previous presentation as well, in particular from the European Space Agency, but there are like other groups as well who are building huge data sets with information that can be super helpful. And then how do you actually navigate through all of that? So that's sort of what we're trying to do with this article that we're working on. And in particular, but it's also tricky because I work also in conflict-affected countries, and it's really we have to be really cautious on making the links between insecurity, climate change, because there's a lot of political factors involved, which makes things more problematic. And also that's why it's really important if you're a journalist and you're working on this, like, okay, how can I find the right data? How to make sure what's more climate related? What are other causes behind this? So it's a really complex issue. So just a disclaimer before we dive into the subject itself. And that's also something where Cornelia worked on also with the Red Cross, which she is going to explain a little bit about, if it works.
Thank you so much. I'm going to have a start while it's, oh, here you go, while it's coming up. So as mentioned, for the topic where we see the interaction between climate impacts, climate change, insecurity or conflict, it's really, really complex. It's a changing dynamic where we can see really not a one-way direction, but more of a loop where different factors are dynamically affecting each other. So we're talking about climate change, but then also about our environmental degradation, conflict, and then really the impacts they have on the people within the areas. So what we see here, it's not just an addition, so where we have different hazards or different impact, but if they come together, they compound. So the impact it has in the end of those people who are within the areas, who are present within the areas, they are facing multiple impacts and multiple hazards at the same time coming together. And just to give a bit more of a real-world example, so what do we mean when we talk about it? We've seen an example in Mozambique in the north, in Cabo Delgado, where we had a lot of people being driven from their homes because of violent conflict happening in the north, really moving further south across the areas, but then settling within the paths of cyclone and within the paths of flood, which at the same time, these are climate-related hazards. We see increase in their intensity as well as in the impact at the moment. So this is where we talk about this intersection where we see those compounding impacts really impacting those exposed people. But now talk on the other hand, what about data? So how is data helping us to unravel those complex dynamics and to really understand the situation? So of course, we have the monitoring of the Earth's surface and atmosphere, and we had this amazing presentation already by Asa earlier, giving some incredible examples on what this looks like. And this type of data, it's so essential for us on the scientific side, on the research, to really understand the long-term impacts, but also how has it come to be as it is today. But then, of course, playing a major role for businesses, for overall security, and just various applications. But one of the really amazing developments we have seen is a change to no-code or low-code platforms, where a lot of the data that is already available, the biggest hurdle can be actually the access, or for people who don't maybe have the exact scientific background to take that first step, delve into the data, start working with it. And now, besides having the data, we're seeing those really amazing platforms. One of them, Google Earth Engine. We have Sentinel Hub, for example, and there's a whole bunch of other ones providing tools and really user-friendly interfaces which allow people to take on this data and leverage what it can offer us. And then, of course, we have a whole range of diverse public data sets, ranging everywhere from hazards to population, environmental indicators, really covering a lot.
Yeah, so the reason we're also doing this is also to make sure to explain to people like there are these data sets available and you can make use of it. Again, we have made here some two examples where these data cubes are being used. So the UNEP has this global environmental situation room, which has a big sort of different sets of layers we can use to look at biodiversity, land change use, etc. And there's also applications of that. So there's the CIGAR database, which takes all these kind of different data sets and try to look into how this affects climate security. No worries, we're going to put all of this in our Bellingcat guide, but again, this is just a short preview. I see that the amazing pictures already used by Asa as well to look at like how do we use this. So it's basically what we do for the climate data. We look at the sort of basic level data, like what kind of data can you find on populations, like sort of static data on boundaries. Then we look at environmental and pollution data, and climate data and hazard data. So for this particular talk, I'm just going to skip through this one. You've seen this one before, but it's a good example how you can visualize certain hazard risk as well. It's a lot of clicking today. So yeah, so we're sort of building that sort of the baseline data. So like I mentioned before, so you start off, if you want to do some research, you can find all these kind of relevant data sets available that's helping if you're looking at a specific area, what you can find on what's in the area to start off. So before you look at any changes. So as I mentioned, there's population. Again, I'm going to have to. So population data. We have data on energy infrastructure you can use. You can zoom in on all kind of different areas. You can find out what kind of electricity pipelines there are or power stations. And it's all very helpful to get a sort of sense of what you're looking at. And there are like really specific data sets as well on what kind of protected areas there are in this particular neighborhood. And even like if you use, for example, Wikimapia, you can also find all kind of industrial sites. So it gives you sort of the basic picture of what you're looking at. And then there's like wider data, so environmental and pollution data. So all the sensor systems I mentioned before, ESA, NASA, other satellite constellations, which are collecting all these things that are capturing all these different impacts. The one example already given here was, for example, Global Forest Watch. So I give you an example from my own work here on Syria, where we looked at deforestation. This is like a database which has existing models built in from NASA satellite imagery using Landsat to monitor deforestation. As you can see here, throughout the conflict, there has been massive deforestation in the west of Syria. So we expanded that whole research in a wider project, and we found that over 40% of all Syria's forest disappeared during the conflict. But it started off with this kind of data set where we can use that and to see which areas have been deforested, or tree cover loss, I should say. But there's also like the bigger data sets from the FAO, which has Earth Map. Again, a range of layers of data on all kind of subjects, but it can help you visualize. So here, for example, you see change in land use over a certain time period. So it helps you to see, like, okay, how is the environment changing? And you can use that data to check it, okay, but why is it changing? And that's the sort of the journalistic question. But it's sort of, I find it really helpful to use all these data layers to understand a bit more of the area of interest that you're working on. And here another example is data sets on water resources. So this one here shows all the water reservoirs where all the water is measured. So here, for example, I took an example of the, not sure how to pronounce this, Tejo River, Tejo, which looks at the water levels in the river throughout the ages. So these are all like changes in the environment of the specific area you're looking into, and then you can move on to more climate data.
So now to give a quick introduction on climate data and when we start looking into it. So in this classification, we have, thank you, we have 54 essential climate variables separated into 3 groups about the atmosphere, land, and ocean. So across the 3 groups, for example, we would have the precipitation, temperature, different types, sea surface temperature, also the glaciers. We had already a couple of different ones today. This one is, I feel like, a really good starting point, especially for those of you who are about to get started, to start looking into climate variables. Because for those who already have done it will know, and for those who are going to will experience it, the hardest step at the beginning, once you have a question and you know what you're looking for, is to really see what is the climate variable, which is going to give you the answer or let you understand whatever it is that you're trying to understand to investigate in this context. If we look into temporal context, we have kind of the 2 big groups where we have the observational data looking into the past or the historical data. This is also connected to the reanalysis. So this is the historic records about, for example, rainfall, about temperature. I think in our daily life, you've all sooner or later heard about those. And then with the reanalysis, we're able to kind of smooth it out and create a full understanding on the past and how the climate has evolved over the past until as of today. And then for the second one is really looking into the future, which could be our weather forecast with just a couple of days, which we hear every day. But it can also be seasonal climate conditions. So that would be the seasonal forecast, for example, in terms of precipitation that's going to come or general climate events. And then, of course, we have the long-term climate projections. Those ones are going to go ahead for a couple of decades or even further in the future based on models to try see how are our actions and our interactions going to impact our future climate going forward. So here, just an example from observational data. Why is it so important that we have it? It really helps us to understand how the climate has come. Here's an example from East Africa. On the left, you see average annual rainfall based on observational data. And then, of course, you have the minimum and the maximum temperature, so really get us an understanding of the climate conditions in the past, and then, of course, showing us some for the present as it has come. And then as a last mentioning of data types, so then we have the, of course, hazard data. Here's an example from the UNEP Geneva Grid, which is an open source platform which has really amazing global data sets on different climate hazards. So for climate hazards, we'd mainly look into extreme heat waves, but also cold spells, droughts, floods, big storms like hurricanes, cyclones, and typhoons, wildfires across the globe, sea level rise, and heavy precipitation, often connected to landslides. Of course, there's a couple more, but this is the main ones we're looking into at the moment.
So we have 2 use cases, so we're going to apply it quickly to show how we've done it. And I'm not going to go through all the data that we have for it, but here, for example, the exterior, and we look at water impacts. We get a lot of questions from journalists, okay, how is the water situation impacting the communities on the ground? So we have 12 years of conflict in Syria. There have been discussions over to what extent climate change was the impact on that, but we are really cautious with that because there were a lot of political factors and the repression that led to the rise up of the population against Assad. But there were droughts leading up to the revolution, so that's really good to look at what does it mean, and also look at how can we use that data now, because some things have been happening with the current droughts and the lack of data on, or the lack of water flow into Syria from the Euphrates. So, as I mentioned, we get a lot of questions. It's covered a lot by international media on what's happening in the area, how is the lack of water impacting communities. So I'm going to use three tools here quickly. The first one I showed you before as well is the Dahiti, which looks at water reservoirs. So you can see up here, there's the water basins which were built in the 90s by Turkey to really basically irrigate the whole area here for agriculture. That meant like all the water which is going to the Euphrates River here is like stored here. Then the Sot Lake was built here also to capture water for irrigation. But after the war, in particular in the last 5-6 years, there is a decrease of water. So using the Dahiti database, you can really check like, okay, what's actually happening with these kind of water sources here. So here you see the reservoir from the Assad Lake, which is over there. And you can definitely see there's a sharp decrease in the water flow into the lake from the last couple of years, which explains the drought. And at the same time, we can also look at the Ataturk level lake. So you can see it's also decreasing as well over the time. So, and this is really important because people usually say, well, Turkey is withholding water because of political reasons, but Turkey is also facing drought and needs to retain water for its agriculture. But still, it's good to visualize some of the changes and also with data. Another tool we talked about before is Sentinel. We saw some applications before of this. And here if it works, I used the normalized different water index to look at the decrease of, here we go. So I made a time lapse, so you can clearly show the decrease of water just using the NDWI index in the EO browser with Sentinel-2 data. And it's really helpful to show like, okay, actually the water is decreasing in the lake, and you can actually go more into detail level to see how much, and if you zoom in, but just a quick visualization. Another one is we looked at the normalized difference vegetation index, which basically captures the healthy vegetation. Again, we don't quantify here, where for visualization, this is really good. So everything that's like really green means it's healthy vegetation, and the browner is get, it means like less healthy vegetation. So you can see between the 2 years how the lack of rainfall and water really impacted the vegetation in this particular area. You can go a step further, I have a GIS expert working for us who then looked at the precipitation data and sort of visualized it a bit more better with more quantification. But it really helped using the data. You can actually sort of visualize the impacts and also what the implications are, for example, for food security, for water security, and also for like what the political purposes. To use it for what we do for advocacy to talk about transboundary water issues.
So the piece we're currently working on, it's going really to focus on what open data is out there, but also what open tools are out there for everyone to use, to access, without having to have a major knowledge or technology in the background to really create customized visualizations to support the message or to support a piece, support a report. And today I want to show you one data set and one tool, which is both open access and allows to do really amazing, very quickly, straightforward visualizations of climate data. And to showcase it, I've picked one of the examples of a project I've been working on before, which focused on the case of Cyclone Kenneth hitting Cabo Delgado in the north of Mozambique in 2019. And it was an extremely unusual and extremely devastating event for a couple of reasons. It hit way further north than usually cyclones do. It hit the coast just 6 weeks after Cyclone Idai already devastated large parts of Mozambique further in the south. And it really was one of the strongest cyclones to ever make landfall in Mozambique. So for Cyclone Kenneth, it wasn't just the storm itself, but it brought torrential rainfalls, which started off before it made landfall and led on already after the cyclone dissolved. And it really created extended flooding all across Cabo Delgado, causing major damages to infrastructure and displacing a large number of people. But for today, to take this as an example, I really want to look into the question. So how can the extreme event of Cyclone Kenneth be visualized to show the extreme weather event and how it unfolded? And for this, I want to talk about one open source data set. There's multiple other ones. For today, I'm going to focus on the global precipitation measurement data set from NASA, which allows to get precipitation in a rate of millimeter per hour on a 30-minute timely resolution all across the globe. And this is the tool I want to talk about today. It's called the NASA Giovanni tool. Also, it's openly available, and what it allows you is to access the database and all the data that is up there on climate variables from the NASA database, really customize it on what you need in terms of the place in the world and your time for your case to look into, and then go forward and create visualizations out of it. So in this case, you see up on select plot, up on the left, this is where you're going to select what exactly you want to visualize. Up on select data range, this gives you the option to go into the days or the month you're looking for. Select region, I'm going to show an example. You can go across the whole globe or really into a very specific location. And then here on the left, you have all of the climate variables where you currently have data sets available. This is going to get a sub-selection as soon as you select the areas and your timeline, and then allows you to look for the climate variable you need and want to explore. Here you go. So the first question and the first visualization is going to be, how much did it rain where because of Cyclone Kenneth? In this case, I mentioned the first step is to select your geographic area. In this case, it was the north of Mozambique, Cabo Delgado, and then the ocean area between Madagascar and Mozambique, which is where the cyclone formed and then moved towards making landfall. In this case, I'm looking for a map of accumulated rainfall. So in the select plot, you can see the type. And then here you can see the selection. So for the date range, I'm looking for the 25th of April, which is the day Cyclone Kenneth made landfall on the coast, up until the 28th, which was the torrential rainfalls lasted up until the date. And then selecting the data set, in this case, I'm looking for, as mentioned, accumulated precipitation on a daily rate in terms of time. So if you run it through the tool, this is what you're going to get out in the end. I did a little refining afterwards on the colors and on the layout. But overall, this is what the tool is going to give you. So you have on the right side the legend, which is telling you the total amount of rainfall that went down within those 4 days in millimeters. So we had in yellow is our highest rate of rainfall, which went up to 671 millimeter within those 4 days. On the top, a little small to read right now, but it's going to tell you exactly the type of the plot, the type of the map, the data that went into it, the data range. So it's really specifying the visualization you're seeing right now. So again, for this one, it's our first graph on accumulated rainfall. So it's really meant to show where were our areas, where were the highest intensity, and how did this event accumulated over this time. So for a second graph, I wanted to know how much does it usually rain in April? We've seen now those numbers from this one event, but really, is this normal? Does this happen every year? Is this really out of the ordinary? So to put it into perspective and to understand how much out of the ordinary, if at all, this event was, we're going to look into what is normal for this area. So going back to the tool, it's now a map on recurring averages, which means I'm going a long time period, and you can either select specific days, specific months, or specific season, which is going to give you the average across those timeframes across a long time. So in this case, this is the result graph. Again, you see up on the top April month from 2001 to 2018, it's giving you kind of the data and the background information. On the right, we see the legend. So here we can see that in our area, which is in kind of light blue, dark blue, which you see on the legend, is around 15 to 20 millimeter, which means that usually, and in this time period between 2000 and 2018, in the whole month of April, it would rain around 20 millimeter for the whole month. If you remember the graph before, it showed us we had up to 600 millimeter in 4 days. So this really shows how out of the ordinary this torrential rainfall event was. Okay, how much has it rained at this time of the year in the past? So in this case, I'm looking for a graph on a time series to really understand each of the year, what was the history. And you can see here in 2019, where Cyclone Kenneth hit, how far, again, out of the ordinary this event was looking into the time series. And for our last graph, how did the extreme event evolve and unfold? So if we talk about climate events or climate extreme events, disasters, it's always a dynamic process over time and space. So having like one static graph or one static map can tell us a lot, but it really doesn't tell us the temporal evolvement. So in this case, I was looking into an animation to create really the steps and how this event unfolded between the 22nd of April until the 28th of April. Now I'm looking into time resolution of 30 minutes, so I really want to know every half an hour how was the rainfall constitution across the area. So going through this is going to give you this as an output where you can see again on top all your information, the legend on the right, and then some information on the animation tab. And this is what the result is going to look like. So you can actually see Cyclone Kenneth moving in up on the north. And you can see up on top the timestamp where it's telling you what day we're looking at. It's now the 24th of April, and then also the time next to it. And you can really follow the event and how it unfolded. And what I find really fascinating is, again, this is now showing the rainfall pattern. The light, so the orange and the red means most intense one. But even though this is not the storm itself, but it's the rainfall it's causing, it's really showing us the spatial temporal evolvement of the storm by just observing the rainfall. As a very quick last point, so what if you wanted to take out these information and plot them? There's 4 different options. You can export as a GeoTIFF or NetCDF if you do have GIS skills. If you don't, you can either directly take a PNG and save it as this, or you can use a KMZ file and directly import it into Google Earth Pro, which allows you to really put this information you have now about a climate variable and about that data. What does it mean for the human geography? So you're able to overlay it with satellite imagery, with information about cities and borders and similar to really understand, okay, we have got the rainfall, we've got the intensity, but what are the things that are actually in the path of it and in the way? And as a very last note, there you go. Very last one, so for flooding for Cyclone Kenneth, you can see here a map of the flood extents of one of the areas in the north, really showing how far the flooding that was caused by this rainfall reached. And talking about the intersection with conflict and climate, we have seen ever since people from the north of Cabo Delgado being displaced by violent conflict and settling within those same areas we just observed being heavily flooded because of torrential rainfalls. If you're interested in seeing more about it, there's a story map called Climate Disasters and Conflict in Cabo Delgado. It's published and on the internet, so you can find it if you type that in. And here you go.
Yeah, so this again was like a first sneak preview. So we're building this whole article for Bellingcat, which will be online. We will be having a database with every source available and an application of some of the tools to help you guide you through it and make use of it. So I really hope to encourage you to use all the Earth observation, remote sensing, open source investigative tools and data sets to use it for your climate investigative story. So as soon as it's online, we share it also with the events, with the IICG, and then hopefully that you can share it, you can access it, and will be helpful for your research. So thank you very much for your attention. It was a very nerdy talk, but it hopefully was useful.